So the national carrier, Kenya Airways, is set to clamp down on its loss-making streak. Of course, it did announce losses this year, and that's just one of the topics that we're set to discuss today with our resident analyst, Ken Gishiga. Welcome to the program. And of course, Abi Agina and Noah Kimboi. I mean, Kenya Airways, losses and more losses. I mean, it doesn't compare to the 2014, 25 billion. But it did double over the period under review, the half-year earnings. What is happening? Is it working, whatever strategy they're using?
Absolutely. I think it's been 5 years of loss making. I think when I attended the investor briefing, the message I got was something new has to happen at KQ. And what they said was nationalization might be the way. They feel they can compete better with the Gulf Airlines, with Ethiopian Airlines, if they nationalize the structure. So that seems to be like the direction that they want to go.
Nationalization, it's quite interesting, Ken. But looking at the operations, first of all, the financial results. Revenue is increasing. Operation costs, it's also increasing. Now let's look at the philosophy Mikosh is using. He's saying that, you know, the way we turn around this airline is about expansion, flying more. And some people are for the idea that you scale down because, you know, your operation costs are more than what you're generating at the end of the day. Is it a viable, you know, procedure for him to say that the way we'll turn around is about expansion and flying more?
Well, yes and no. He said the flights to New York are doing very well. He said getting a seat on the business class is almost impossible on the New York flights. But if you look at the Johannesburg flight, it's doing very poorly. So obviously they have to try and see which are the areas they have a competitive advantage. And you're right, the costs are increasing fast at a faster pace than the revenue. So the pricing strategy also has to come in place. And I think that's the thinking because the New York route is very price sensitive. Even a small increase in price means a reduction in the passengers. So they have to do that route by route to determine if that's the way forward.
All right.
Abi, we cover a lot of stories, especially when it comes to these really subsidized airlines, Ethiopian Airlines, the Gulf carriers, Etihad, and most of these ones are subsidized. And Kenya Airways reckons, you know, once it's fully nationalized in the next 20 or 21 months, that it should be the bullet that will definitely bring it out of his loss-making streak. I mean, should it do somewhat of a copycat with the Gulf carriers in terms of fully nationalizing and getting the much-needed government subsidy?
Well, I just want to agree with Ken. Ken's point was very clear that it's first important for the airline to first stop the bleeding. After that, now we consider the takeoff. And of course, we've seen the top management very actively engaged in terms of trying to minimize the costs, especially when you look at the fuel costs as well as the operational costs, which touch on the size of the fleet. KQ currently flies to over 53 destinations. They've been scaling this down. Some of the routes have not been profitable. Some of the routes, they've had to do overhaul, complete overhaul. But for me, Brenda, going to your question, and as we shall see in Noah Kipkomboi's story, it's very clear that if we take an approach of subsidizing the national carrier, we are sort of shooting ourselves in the foot because when you look at Ethiopian Airlines, they're heavily subsidized by the national government. But when you look at Kenya Airways, the model that they are taking is if they are having control of Kenya Airports Authority, as well as Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, some of the simple costs like landing fees that are usually levied on airlines, as well as the parking fees are quite up the roof. But I'd like us to pause for a minute and just take a story that Noah Kipkemboi did put together, capturing the latest developments around the national carrier.
If you're a shareholder of NBK, and you're being given an opportunity to be a shareholder of KCB, I think it's a very sweet deal.
In 2014, Kenya Airways made a historic loss of 25 billion shillings, the largest ever in corporate Kenya. The airline attributed the loss to competition among a host of other factors, such as operation cost, in the ambitious Project Mawingu, which saw the airline embark on a mission to expand its fleet size. The latest measure to save the airline now hover around the nationalization plan.
The Transport Committee of Parliament under the chairman of Chairman Kossing, came up with a recommendations. It was their recommendation that the best course of action, in their opinion, based on public hearings that they had over a period of 2 weeks, was that the airline should be nationalized.
KQ's chairman, Michael Joseph, notes that merging the two entities is necessary and a boon for the fledgling airline.
And nationalization is not what we want. Okay, it's not what we would like to be. We do not, and I think none of the people working here want to be working in a state-owned corporation for all different connotations. But it's what we need to do in order to be competitive and to bring us back to where we need to be.
As competition in the African skies continues to intensify, the raft of reforms may just help KQ glide back into safe mode, even as operating costs still remain high.
Well, thanks, Noah, for setting the perspective for us. And Noah's simply chipping in on that topic of discussion. But let's get back to our conversation right now, Brenda, and of course, Ken Gishinga. National Bank of Kenya, there's that very big acquisition by Kenya Commercial Bank. As we shall be listening briefly onto this clip where we spoke to the Chief Financial Director at KCB. Let's listen in on that as it creates the path for our discussion.
Kenya Airways made a historic loss of 25 billion shillings, the largest ever in corporate Kenya. The airline attributed the loss to competition among a host of...
If you're a shareholder of NBK and you're being given opportunity to be a shareholder of KCB, I think it's a very sweet deal. You're investing in, you're becoming a shareholder in a bank that has consistently performed, as you said, the largest in Eastern Central Africa, gives the shareholders back their money when we don't need it by way of dividends. So, you know, we've just announced an interim dividend that is payable at the end of the year, based on our half-year results. So you would get a dividend immediately.
Speaking about a sweet deal, Lawrence, of course, how many shares are we looking at in this entire process by the close of trading?
So if 100% of the NBK shareholders participate and accept to swap their shares, and we're looking at issuing, I think it's about 147 million shares, new KCB shares. So our the number of issued shares will rise from about 3 billion to about 3.2 billion once the deal closes.
Well, as you've rightly heard it from the CFO at KCB, Brenda, and of course Ken, looking at the big picture, we are seeing consolidation being another layer of the banking industry. I don't know, what are your immediate thoughts, Brenda?
I would quote the central bank governor. He's always reiterated, so long as they're not being forced to do it, they're doing it willingly. I mean, it's a good thing, because we had at some point up to 43 commercial banks operating in the country. I mean, just a little too many. So he says if the mergers and acquisitions are done willingly, they're merging operations so that they can create an efficient banking system, then why not? So he did give it a thumbs up. The former Treasury CS, Henry Rotich, did also say the consolidation that is currently happening is a good move for the banking industry, because they are consolidating, they're becoming bigger, they're becoming more, when it comes to capitalization of the banking industry, they're becoming more stronger. So it is a thumbs up. When it's a bad thing, it's when a commercial bank is in distress and it needs to be taken over. Now, that one creates a very grim picture when it comes to the banking sector as a whole.
And of course, Ken, what do you make of this acquisition? Because you're seeing KCB is inheriting some very toxic loans from National Bank of Kenya to the tune of 31 billion shillings. Of course, KCB is quite optimistic, saying that they're also looking at other turnaround strategies, especially when it comes to seeing NBK is back to the ground. But what are the inherent risks for KCB in all this?
I mean, obviously managing the process, as you say, of acquiring those loans, because portfolio at risk is a key ratio that all analysts look at, and KCB wants to make sure that that remains low. So obviously selecting, how they go about selecting and managing those. But KCB has a very big balance sheet. So I don't think it should be a big problem.
All right.
But I think on the bigger issue of consolidation, I'm having sort of like a change of heart on that particular topic, because the argument has been we've had 43 banks, and that seems to be a bit too many. But if you think about it, without the interest rate cap, banks have been charging a very high interest rate, which means the demand for credit is very high. And if that's the case, we might actually end up thinking of having more banks to satisfy the demand and not less. So I've been having a bit of a change of heart on that particular area.
Interesting. Brenda, would you like to take us through Telkom Airtel merger? We have a story that you actually worked on.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting turn of events, right? The Director of Public Prosecution did say that they're investigating quite a number of deals that were agreed in the past, and even as well as the current one. The Communications Authority did come out straight and say, hey, look, it's not us that we are stopping the deal, but it's actually the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission. They did tell us that we are investigating this matter and you cannot do anything up until we have given recommendations and findings in relation to this. But just on the flip side, we did have the Telkom Kenya CEO who came out and said it's actually not the current transaction that is being investigated. And he said that it's the past ones where they were not even in office. So he said the current one has fresh managers, has fresh management. So it's not. And he was very optimistic, indicating that the deal should be completed by the end of the year. So he said the current deal is not under investigations. We had the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission on the flip side saying that we have stopped the transaction until investigations are done. So you're having two sides that are giving very conflicting statements. But what remains is the fact that Telkom Kenya is under investigations by the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission because of how the transfer deals were made when it comes to recapitalizing these specific institutions, the farm. So it's quite an interesting affair because it's a developing story that we are definitely looking forward to following and finding the report.
Interesting. And Ken, just your quick closing thoughts on this particular merger. Will it tilt the market?
If you think about it, for the longest time, Safaricom has been considered the dominant player. I think the thinking behind the merger was this was supposed to be the game changer in terms of bringing some parity in the industry. But what Brenda has just described shows that we are very far from that promised land, and there's a lot more to come.
A lot more to come, indeed. And Brenda, I'm told we are out of time.
Yes, we are. Abby, of course, always a pleasure having you, Ken Gishinga, on the program. We really appreciate your time. And Abby, of course, thank you so much. And of course, we have to close now, but we leave you with Embrace in Kilifi County.